Good morning, Union Road family. It's good to have a sound system that's working this morning, so thank you to Stephen and Jeff for coming up on Friday and Saturday to work on our speakers to make sure we can hear each other without a buzzing sound. I want to ask us to open our Bibles to Colossians chapter 3. Colossians chapter 3. A few weeks ago, we introduced our theme, our focus for the month of February, and that is to remove idols. And more specifically, when we introduced this focus for February, we looked at the source of our idols, trying to identify why we have idols in our life. Go to the very source. And addressing the source is important. How many of us have had a headache at some point in our life? I think most of us at some point have had a headache, right? And we go to the source of that problem. You see, when we have a headache, we want to go to the source because that's important. How you treat a migraine is different than how you treat a headache that's caused from a sinus infection, which is still different than how you treat a headache caused by brain cancer. If you do ibuprofen for a sinus infection, you're not going to feel any better because the sinus infection still exists. So you want to take one of those sinus decongestants, right? Or if you're taking ibuprofen and you have brain cancer, you may feel a little touch better, but the brain cancer is still there. And so you want to find the right source or the right cure to address the source of the problem. It's the same way with our idols. Once we identify the source of our idols, we need to go to the source to remove those idols. But removing those idols is easier said than done. So often what do we like to do instead? We have these idols in our life, these things that are trying to take our attention away from God, and yet rather than completely removing them from our lives, we try to serve God in the idol of wealth, God in the idol of pleasure, God in the idol of the passions in our life. And over and over and over again in Scripture, God tells us in His Word that doesn't work. That when God calls us to serve Him, to follow Him, to obey Him, He's telling us there can't be any idols in our life. He's telling us that God wants our whole heart. Giving someone our whole heart isn't something that's uncommon for us to do even in our society today. Just this last week, I believe it was Monday, it was Valentine's Day. Husbands, those with significant others, I hope you didn't forget. If you did forget, chocolates are on clearance at Walmart right now. Go make up for it. But what do we do on Valentine's other than tell our significant other, you're my one and only. You have my heart, right? That's what we do on Valentine's Day. What do we do when we gather to watch two people join together in holy matrimony and holy marriage, right? We, in those vows, at least back in Tennessee, it's not uncommon for someone to say, forsaking all others, right? What if as they're doing their vows and they're saying forsaking all others, someone said, yeah, but I'd still like to date my ex? That would be just a bit of a problem, right? Because when you're gathered up here in front of the presence of so many witnesses saying you want to be married, you're saying, I want to forsake all others. I want to leave all the other people in my past behind to love you, to focus on you. I want to give you my whole heart. You see, when we follow Christ, it's like marriage. We're entering a covenant relationship with Christ. A covenant relationship that's built on the idea that we're going to follow Him, we're going to love Him, we're going to serve Him, we're going to focus on Christ. What we're doing there is that we're promising to remove all idols and serve God. And that's the point that Paul is making here in Colossians chapter 3. That he wants to show these young disciples there in Colossae what it means to put their old life of sin behind them. The old life with all of its idols, with all of its sin, with all of its passions and pleasures. And he wants to show them how to live for Christ. And so here in Colossians chapter 3, we see how we can remove the idols from our life. And so as we read through Colossians today, I want us to look for three simple instructions, three simple commands that Paul gave the Colossians, that Paul is giving us even today on how we can remove the idols from our life. Let's go ahead and read Colossians chapter 3, verses 1 through 4. So if you've been raised with Christ, seek the things above where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Set your mind on things above, not on earthly things, for you died. That should sound familiar from our reading from Romans chapter 6 this morning. And your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you will also appear with him in glory. The first instruction Paul gives to these Colossians here in Colossians chapter 3, that if you want to remove idols, you need to focus on Christ. And so 4 times in the 4 verses we just read, Paul mentions Christ. You see it there in verse 1. You see it again in verse 1. You see it in verse 3. And you see it in verse 4. And you even see Christ referenced there in verse 4 at the very end in the pronoun him. Paul wants us to understand here in the text that the key to removing idols is focusing on Christ. The key to removing idols in our lives, the key to putting sin behind us, those idols that are behind all of our sin that we talked about 2 weeks ago, the key to that is by setting our mind on things above. And focusing on Christ is not something we do one time and never do again. Paul says focusing our minds on things above, focusing on Christ, is something we do every day. That the moment our alarm clock goes off, if you're retired, the moment you wake up, your mind goes to Christ. As we're living our life, every decision that we make is made through the lens of how we can focus our minds and our hearts and our life on Christ. And that's hard. That's difficult. Because from the moment we wake up in the morning, we roll over and we grab that thing that's right next to our bed that we were staring at the night before. It's called our smartphone. And we're checking for emails, we're checking our social media, and we're checking our text messages. And right away, the moment we wake up, our mind is scattered. Our mind isn't focused. But what Paul is calling us to do here in Colossians chapter 3 is to focus on Christ. And thankfully, Paul tells us how we can do that. There in verse 3 and 4, more specifically verse 3, he says, you died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. We do it by remembering that our old man, as we read again in Romans chapter 6 this morning, that old man was put to death on the cross. And we've been raised to walk in newness of life. Paul says here in Colossians chapter 3, if we've been raised with Christ, we're going to live with a new mindset. We're going to live with new priorities. And here in Colossians 3, he says, our past experience of dying with Christ affects the way we live and focus on Christ in the present, because we have a hope of glory with Christ in the future. And yet, for so many of us, our minds aren't focused on things above. We aren't focused on Christ. We are focused on our 401ks, and don't look at them right now. They're in the tank. So focus on Christ. Our minds are focused on our families. Our minds are focused on our homes. Our minds are focused on our jobs and our hobbies. For so many of us, Jesus isn't the priority in our life. We aren't really seeking things above. Yes, Jesus is important to us. After all, we want Jesus to save us when he comes again in glory. But we really aren't focused on him now. He's not the number one priority in our life. It's easy for us even today to trick ourselves into thinking that perhaps Christ is our priority. That after all, we come to church 3 times a week. After all, we're gathering every time the doors are open. But is Christ really the priority in our life? Is He really the number one focus of our life? When we're at work, are we focused on how the decisions we make at work glorify Christ? Are we focused on how the decisions we make at work can get us a promotion? When we're at home, how are we focused on how the decisions we make in our homes can glorify Christ in our homes? Or are we focused on just getting through the day and getting to the next? What Paul is telling us here in the first 4 verses of Colossians 3 is that focusing on Christ is the key to removing idols from our life. Focus, what we set our minds on, is important for spiritual revival, which is our overall theme for the year, because focus determines the direction of our life. Think about the student. The student wants to be valedictorian. So what does he focus on? He focuses on his studies, right? The athlete who wants to win a gold medal at the Winter Olympics that's going on right now that apparently no one is tuning into because I haven't seen any Facebook status about curling. That athlete is focused on winning the gold medal. That businessman who wants to grow his business, he's focused on anything that he can do to grow his business. And anything that doesn't grow his business, anything that keeps them from winning a gold medal, anything that keeps them from being straight A student is tossed aside. Because for that student, being valedictorian is number one priority. For the businessman, growing his business is the number one priority. For the athlete, winning that gold medal, standing on that stage with the gold medal around their neck is the number one priority in their life. They've set their minds on being great in their respective field. It's the focus of their life. And so the point that Paul is trying to stress here in the first 4 verses is that we need to be focused on Christ. And that until we focus on Christ, it's going to be difficult to remove those idols from our life. But Paul goes on there, beginning in verse 5. In Colossians chapter 3, Paul gives us a second command, second instruction on how we can remove idols. Beginning in Colossians chapter 3 and verse 5. Therefore, Paul says, here's how you can put off idols. Here's how you can focus on Christ. He says, put to death what belongs in your earthly nature. Sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desire, and greed, which is idolatry. Because of these, God's wrath is coming upon the disobedient. And you once walked in these things, and you were living in them. But now, Paul says, put away all of the following: anger, wrath, malice, slander, and filthy language from your mouth. Do not lie to one another, since you have put off the old self with its practices. I'm going to go out on a limb, and maybe you caught that second instruction that Paul gives us here in the text. But that second instruction is to put off the old man. You see, if we're going to focus on Christ, we have to put off that old man of sin with all of its idols, with all of its practices. And so 3 times there in the text, Paul says, put off the old man. You see, if we're going to remove those idols, if we're going to remove those sins from our life that Paul describes there in verse 5 and verse 8, those sins like sexual immorality and impurity and lust and evil desire and greed, which is idolatry. And maybe some of us are going, well, I haven't struggled with that this week. Okay, maybe you haven't. But let's skip down to verse 8. Anger and wrath and malice and slander and filthy language, lying to one another. How many of us have struggled with those sins? this week. So what Paul is calling these Colossians to do is put off these idols that are trying to take away their attention from Christ. Try to take those idols off. And you see, these Colossians, they knew all about idols. Like so many cities in the ancient world, they had idols all over the place. And so idols and this imagery was very familiar to them. And even now here in the book of Colossians, you can see how that idol influence, those sinful influences in the world around them and the city around them are affecting the church there in Corinth. And in fact, if you take a step back and we were to read the entire book of Colossians this morning, we would see little allusions of Paul here in the text of Colossians, how the Colossian Christians were having a little bit of a complex, a little bit of a struggle, how they were trying to serve Jesus and idols. The Greek Christians there in Colossians were trying to serve Jesus in Greek philosophy and the Greek way of life. The Jewish Christians there in Colossae were trying to serve Jesus and the old law and the Jewish traditions. And what Paul is saying is, you're living in the past. They were living as if they still belonged to the world. And so here in Colossians 3, Paul says, stop living like you belong to the world. Stop living in the past. Put off the old man. Paul tells them, stop living as if idols, stop living as if sin still controls your life. You know, one of the best examples of an idol controlling someone's life is found there in Matthew chapter 19. With the rich young ruler. How the rich young ruler comes to Jesus and says, good teacher, what good thing must I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus replies, well, love God, love others. And he goes, I've done that. I've kept the commands. And Jesus looks at the rich young ruler and says, okay, sell all that you own and come follow me. And the text there in Matthew chapter 19 describes how the rich young ruler went away weeping, for he had many possessions. You see, when Jesus looked at the rich young ruler and says, sell all that you own, his idol was exposed. His idol was his wealth. His idols were his possessions. And that even though the rich young ruler wanted to follow Jesus, he was trusting in his fortune. He worshiped his fortune. That fortune that he had amassed became his idol. And so he walked away grieving because he wasn't willing to part with his idol. He wasn't willing to leave that idol behind and come and follow Jesus. And you know, a lot of us are like that rich young ruler. When we want to follow Jesus, we're coming to Jesus and asking the good question, good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life? But when he looks at us and says, put your idol away, put off the old self, put away those possessions, and come follow me, we turn away and we go the other direction, weeping because we're not ready to give up our idol. We're just like the Colossians here in Colossians chapter 3, where they're trying to serve Jesus in that old way of life, Jesus in Greek philosophy, Jesus in Jewish traditions. We're trying to follow Jesus in all of the idols that are in our life. We have fooled ourselves into thinking we can serve Jesus in pleasure, Jesus in our idols. And yet the choice Jesus lays before the rich young ruler in Matthew chapter 19, the choice Paul lays before the Colossians here in Colossians chapter 3 is simple. That if you want to follow Jesus, you have to put off the old man. You have to remove those idols and sin from your heart. And the choice that Jesus and Paul lay before us today is a question, it's a choice of eternal importance. Because just as Paul says there in the Colossians, and to the Colossians there in verse 6, that because of their sin, because of their idols. There in verse 6 he says, God's wrath is coming on the disobedient. Because of sin, because of the idols in our life, God will come in judgment on the wicked. So the question for us is, are we willing to put off the old man of sin? Are we willing to remove the idols from our life? Are we willing to focus entirely on Christ? Because that's exactly what Paul is calling us to do here in this text. And until we remove the idols from our life, until we put off the old man of sin and focus entirely on Christ, we will struggle to enjoy the blessings of spiritual revival. But Paul concludes and gives a third command here in the text, beginning in verse 9. And this is catching mid-sentence, and most of your translations will note that. But Paul begins there in verse 10, having put on the new self, you are being renewed in knowledge according to the image of your Creator. For in Christ, he says, there is not Greek and Jew, circumcision and uncircumcision, barbarian, Scythian, slave and free, but Christ is in all and in all. The third and final instruction Paul gives here in the text of Colossians chapter 3, that if we want to remove idols, we have to put on the new man. See, once we remove those idols, Paul says, from our life, once we put to death the man of sin, the malice and slander and filthy language, the lust and sexual immorality that plagues our life, we have to fill it with something. We have to put on something else. And that's putting on the new man. And the idea of putting on new clothes is a little bit familiar for us here at Union Road who've been going over the 100 great events in our back classrooms. Just a couple of weeks ago, what did we read about in a study? We read about the priestly garments, right? And how Aaron and his sons were consecrated to serve as priests for Israel. And what went on to that consecration process? There in, I think it was Leviticus 8, they had to wash. They took off their old clothes and put on new clothes. New clothes to serve as God's priest. And so Paul draws on this image of being washed, taking off your old clothes, being washed and putting on new clothes, because that's what the priests do, and we are priests of God Most High even today. And so Paul tells the Colossians, put off the old man. You've been washed. You've died with Christ. Put on the new man. That new man who, just like the priests there in the Old Testament, are called to serve God. The new man who is being renewed in knowledge. That if you're a disciple of Christ, you are being renewed in your mind every day. That there is a constant spiritual revival going on in the hearts of all believers as they focus more on Christ, as they continue to put off that old man of sin and continue to put on the new man that is being transformed into the image of their Creator. And with this transformation, this putting on of the new man, comes an internal change in our heart that has external change in the way we live. And so Paul describes there in verses 12 through 15 how the new man lives. He's very specific, beginning there in verse 12. Therefore, Paul says, if you've put on the new man, this is how you're going to live. As God's chosen ones, holy and dearly loved, put on compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, patience, bearing with one another, forgiving one another if anyone has a grievance against another. Just as the Lord has forgiven you, you also are to forgive. And above all, put on love, which is the perfect bond of unity. And let the peace of Christ, to which you were also called in one body, rule your hearts. And be thankful. The instruction Paul says that describe the new man that we're supposed to put on, they're hard. They're difficult sometimes. It's hard to be kind. It's hard to be humble. It's hard to be gentle sometimes. It's hard to bear with one another. Sometimes it's hard to forgive one another. Sometimes it's hard to love one another because we're different. And because we're different, we have different personality quirks. We have different opinions, different judgments. All these things are threatening to tear us apart and cause us to put back on the old man of envy and strife. And yet here in the text, Paul tells us, if you want to remove idols, focus on Christ, put off the old self, put on the new self that is focused on bearing with one another, that is focused on forgiving one another, that is focused on loving one another. Look there in verse 15 real quick. And let the peace of Christ, to which you were also called in one body, rule your hearts, and be thankful. That if we want to put on the new man, that new man that is striving to grow into Christ-likeness, that new man that is being renewed in knowledge every day, Paul says we have to let the peace of Christ rule. Let Christ be our standard. Let the example of Christ rule in our hearts. And yet, as we think about the example of Christ and what he did during his life here on earth, what did he do with his life? He loved. He was kind. He was gentle. He forgave. He was humble, and he was patient. Even to the point where he gave his life for us there on the cross. And as we think about the example of Christ, how much conflict would we avoid if we put on Christ? That if we avoided the idol of pride and we put on the new self that is focused entirely on Christ, how much more patient would we be? How much more loving would we be with one another? How much more forgiving would we be toward one another? And there at the end of verse 15 where he says, and be thankful. 2 weeks ago we saw that the root of all idolatry is a lack of gratitude. How many idols could we remove in our lives? How much more praise and thanksgiving could flow from our lips if we were focused more on Christ, if we were focused more on putting off the old man and putting on the new man that was growing to be more and more like Christ. Christ is calling the Colossians. Christ is calling us even today to look at Christ as our ultimate example. That Christ needs to be first in our life. That if we want to remove idols, if we want to enjoy spiritual revival, Christ has to be number one. And so maybe you're a disciple of Christ this morning. You've been washed in the waters of baptism, but the pressures of this world, the cares of this world, the idols of this world have taken your eye off the ball. You're no longer living as if Christ is your number one priority, and you need to make a change in your life. You want to recommit your life to Christ. You need the prayers of fellow disciples to pray over you, to pray for you, and to pray with you so you can go once again, leave here rejoicing because Christ is the priority in your life. Or maybe you're here this morning and you have not put on Christ in baptism. You're still walking in the old man of sin, that old man that is described as full of idols and sexual immorality and filth and filthy language and all those sins that we saw about there in Colossians 3 and verse 5 and verse 8. Does that describe your life this morning? And maybe this morning you're ready to put off that old man of sin and leave here rejoicing because you've put off the idols in your life and you're focused on Christ. Maybe you realize that you are broken and you need to focus on Christ. If we can help you in any way, please come forward. Our front rows are open. Please come forward as we stand and sing.